Hello everyone, I am happy to welcome you to yet another session of the NPTEL course, Postmodernism and Literature. Today's discussion is titled Critiques of Postmodernism, a Marxist Perspective. As the title implies, this is a discussion about the varied forms of criticisms which have been levelled against the idea of postmodernism. So far we have been looking at the number of ways in which postmodernism have been defined and the critical frameworks, the conceptual frameworks which we shall be using to access postmodernism from a literary and cultural point of view. And we have also looked at major terminologies, major theories, major interventions in the postmodern age, particularly the kind of interventions which would help us to read various texts and contexts in the contemporary literary and cultural scenario. In that context, it is also very important to understand that there are a number of charges, a number of criticisms which are being levelled against the idea of postmodernism. This has been done from a range of vantage points, from a range of paradigms, from a range of theoretical standpoints. The most important ones among these could be identified from within the frameworks of Marxism as well as feminism. In today's session, we shall be particularly focusing on the Marxist perspective and how the Marxists have found the postmodern ideas very incompatible and how they have been rejecting a number of postmodern concepts. So, at the outset of this discussion, we begin talking about two works which were predominantly from the Anglo-American tradition, and they also responded to the idea of postmodernism, particularly the ideas put forward by Baudrillard and Lyotard. From the previous discussions of the earlier weeks, we are also familiar that Baudrillard spoke about hyperreality, about the idea of simulation, simulacra, and Lyotard sought to define postmodernism as the incredulity toward meta-narratives. And both of these works and the concepts and the frameworks that they introduce have been seminal to the understanding of post-structuralism as well as postmodernism. And we have also notably looked at a number of things in the contemporary which also reflect the ideas that they spoke about, which also could be seen as an extension of the theories that they had put forward. So, these two works, particularly by Frederick Jameson and Terry Eagleton, and from the Marxist perspective, they challenge the ideas, they critique the ideas put forward by Baudrillard and by Lyotard, and they also extended the discussion to a larger critique of postmodernism in general. And two articles by Jameson and by Terry Eagleton appeared in 1984 and 1985 respectively in this noted Marxist journal New Left Review. Jameson's article was further extended and published as a book-length work in 1991 titled Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism. Terry Eagleton's essay, Capitalism, Modernism and Postmodernism, could be read as a close corollary to Jameson's work. In today's session, we begin looking at some of the things that Jameson puts forward and also how postmodernism could be seen as a departure from a number of Marxist ideas, and also how Marxists find it compulsive to reject the ideals of postmodernism because they find a number of concepts related to the same as being incompatible to the ideas, to the ideology of Marxism. Frederick Jameson, who was born in 1934, could be seen as one of the leading figures of literary theory and also a notable Marxist critic. He consistently explored questions of social, economic and cultural change raised by postmodernism, and also he focused on the changing nature of capitalism and the place of Marxism within it. So, in that sense, his work could be seen as critiquing not just postmodernism, but postmodernism as an offshoot of capitalism, and particularly late capitalism, as his work's title also implies. According to Jameson, postmodernism is not one among the many periods, it is not one among the many ages in history, but on the contrary, it is a very dominant age, and there is a particular reason for Jameson to say that the postmodern age is also a dominant age. It is also because it draws much, its significance is drawn much from the context of the late capitalist society. If we recall some of the discussions that we had earlier in context of the definitions related to postmodernism, postmodernism and postmodernity has always been associated with highly developed capitalist societies. It's a phenomenon which is seen in computerized societies and also in advanced societies. It's something which is related to societies which have been part of the mass media culture in the 20th century. It's also related to a kind of disillusionment, a kind of degradation, and a move away from the traditional modernist notions which have been particularly exemplified in advanced, modernized, technologized, computerized, advanced capitalist societies. So in that sense, Jameson's critique also needs to be seen as a critique of capitalism. I reiterate, he views postmodernism as an offshoot of late capitalism. Before we proceed into the details of the various arguments that Jameson makes in his work, Postmodernism, the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, let's provide a brief outline of the critiques of postmodern culture that he offers at the outset. Postmodernism and postmodernity, as we know it, had effaced the frontier between high culture and mass culture, and this is also something that distinctively demarcates postmodernism from the modernist trends. A number of critics such as Jameson were very unsettled by this sort of a breakdown of the frontier, because it also marked a particular kind of political tendency which showed a dominant shift towards capitalism. And among the other critiques of postmodern culture, Jameson particularly points out the postmodern fascination with schlock and Keach. So it's important to understand what these terms are. Schlock refers to cheap, inferior goods, which have also become extremely popular in the postmodern digitized 20th century culture. And Keach refers to certain kinds of art forms which are which could be considered as in poor taste, but it also gets appreciated in a particular context, though in an ironical and also in a very different way. So it's important to look at a way in which Keach has been defined in contemporary terms. Keach has been defined as a reduction of aesthetic objects or ideas into easily marketable forms. So it's also maintains a close relation with the commercialization of art, and also with the ideas of globalization and the ideas of modern forms of art getting reduced into marketable goods. Some theories of postmodernism see the Keachification. This is also a term which exists in connection with the postmodern condition. Some theories of postmodernism see the Keachification of culture as one symptom of the postmodern condition. Jean Baudrillard provides us with a useful definition. The Keach object is commonly understood as one of that great army of trashy objects made of plaster of Paris or some such imitation material, that gallery of cheap junk accessories, falsy knickknacks, souvenirs, lampshades or fake American masks, which proliferate everywhere with a preference for holiday resorts and places of leisure. As Baudrillard goes on, to the aesthetics of beauty and originality, Keach opposes its aesthetics of simulation. Everywhere it reproduces objects smaller or larger than life. It imitates material in plastic, etc. It apes forms or combines them discordantly. It repeats fashion without having been part of the experience of fashion. This proliferation of Keach, which is produced by the industrial reproduction and the vulgarization at the level of objects of distinctive signs taken from all registers, the bygone, the neo, the exotic, the foxy, the futuristic, and from a disordered excess of ready-made signs, has its basis like mass culture, the sociological reality of the consumer society. Keach remains on the whole completely unself-conscious and without any political or critical edge. At a later point in one of the sessions, we shall also be discussing some of these things in detail when we talk about postmodern narrative techniques. It may be possible to see Schlock and Keach as very liberating from a certain sense, but at the same time, it's also important to look at how Marxist critics view this as a reduction of certain kinds of culture, and also how the reduction of all forms of art into Schlock and Keach further moves art away from the possibility of a political or a cultural understanding of art. And the other criticism against postmodernism is that the commercial culture is no longer held at bay in the postmodern phase. Instead, the commercial culture, it's being incorporated into postmodern art. This is in stark contrast to what happened during the modernist phase, where there did exist a commercial kind of art, but it was held at bay. There was a very clear distinction between the high art of modernism and the mass popular low art, which was to be consumed by the common mass public. And finally, the major criticism that Jameson also levels against postmodernism is that the characteristic mode of postmodern art, postmodern culture in general seems to be pastiche and blank parody. It's all about imitation. There is no sense of an original idea or an original art at all. So why should these things begin to worry anyone from a postmodern perspective? If there is a breakdown of distinction across high and mass culture, and if the postmodernists are fascinated with Schlock and Keach, and if commercial culture is no longer held at bay, and if the characteristic mode is pastiche and blank parody, why do we have to worry about it? What are the consequences of this? So Marxist, particularly Jameson, he begins to argue that this also leads to the disappearance of the subject, and consequently it also leads to the loss of history. And the loss of history has a further fatal consequence because it deprives art of originality, because originality is also an act of historicizing, it's also a part of history. And postmodern art, in that sense, it begins to no longer represent a real past. We only have a sense of ideas or stereotypes about the past. Everything is reduced to pop history, just like pop art. When there is a loss of history, when there is an absence of historicity, the Marxists begin to feel extremely uncomfortable and also incompatible with the postmodern theorists. This is also because Marxism draws much from a sense of history, and also its conceptual and theoretical frameworks are closely linked with the many things which happen in history to real men and women. In order to understand the implications of the criticisms leveled against postmodernism from a Marxist point of view, we also need to understand Marxism in context. Marxist criticism, as we all know, is an offshoot of the political and economic theory developed by Marx and Engels in 19th century. And in terms of when we begin to use Marxism as a critical framework, as a conceptual framework to understand, read and critique art and culture, it is a kind of theory which allows us to locate all forms of culture within a social context. And when we say forms of culture, it could be just about anything. It could be art, it could be painting, it could be music, literature, films, and anything which is produced in a cultural context. So in that sense, a Marxist approach to questions of aesthetics is also linked inevitably with questions of class, economic conditions, and power. And the Marxist criticism, the Marxist critical approach towards various cultural phenomena and cultural texts, it also tries to explore power relations embedded and concealed in cultural texts. It also operates with the inherent assumption that every cultural text, every literary text, every representation of culture is also a product, a byproduct, and an offshoot of every single political, economic, and power shifts which are happening in the society. An art form, a cultural form, according to the Marxist framework, cannot exist, cannot be generated, cannot be produced in isolation with the existing power structure or the existing political and socio-historical conditions. And for the same reason, Marxist criticism is also known as materialist criticism, because it explores the link between the actual material conditions and the cultural forms. It could be the various conditions related to power, politics, means of production, the commercial conditions, so on and so forth. To further make a sense of Jameson's critiques on postmodernism from a Marxist perspective, it's important to take a look at a book published a little earlier in 1981 titled The Political and Conscious Narrative as a Socially Symbolic Act. This work notably offers a commentary on narratives by Jameson, and it is also a part of a number of his writings on postmodern architecture and cyberpunk particularly, and he also uses the Marxist approach to understand, to read and critique culture in the post-industrial era. So his work on narratives also needs to be understood in this context, because he believes that narratives are central to our understanding of reality. It's based on this assumption that he goes on to critique various forms of narrative and their modes of production, and how they engage with the kinds of reality and the kinds of power structures which are inherent in societies. And one of the premises on which his work, The Political Unconscious, rests is that all narratives must be read for their connection with the concrete material realities outside. This refers to the outside of the text. The text could be anything, as we have already noted, in a post-structuralist deconstructive sense. Accordingly, Jameson was also associated with dialectical criticism, of which he was a proponent of. It's also important to further understand what exactly dialectical criticism is. Dialectical criticism requires situating cultural object or a practice within particular specific historical conditions and practices. And it also locates culture within social and political structures. It also encouraging a totalizing form of thinking, which we have noted that postmodern theories, postmodern frameworks, postmodern ideologies are starkly against. Dialectical criticism also encourages to look at narratives as techniques of containment, where the contradictions of history are masked or silent. The term containment is extremely important because from a Marxist perspective, as exemplified by the work by Jameson on narratives, the narratives in general are seen as objects, tools of containment. And this can be further explained because from a Marxist point of view, all narratives are considered political. In that sense, a number of Marxist critics such as Jameson and Terry Eagleton, they look at narratives as political objects. They also engage with the possibility of a narrative being used as a tool for repression. And this works at a very interesting level because according to the Marxist critics, there is a political unconscious in all kinds of literary and cultural texts. When the Marxist critics look at the political unconscious which are available in all kinds of narratives, they are also engaging with narratives in a very unique way. Because they talk about narratives as spaces in which social and political anxieties are transformed and thematized into films, into novels, into various kinds of literary and cultural productions. In that sense, one can either see these narratives as expressions of these anxieties, as expressions of these political and social anxieties. But this is where the Marxists intervene. But they also remain at the level of the narrative. They in turn, narratives thus operate as agents which would manage, control and repress these anxieties, because they do not, the possibility of narratives do not allow these anxieties to erupt into the form of revolution. They manage, the anxieties are managed at the level of the narrative so that they escape the possibility of becoming any kind of a social revolt. And this is also the same logic that the Marxist critics have been giving for the emergence, for the development of narratives and a number of kinds of expressions, particularly in the post-capitalist societies. In other words, the Marxist critics, particularly Jameson's work on narratives, it entails that the narratives transform the threat of a social or political anxiety, which could have potentially led to a revolution, and they limit it to a mere literary representation or a thematic representation in the form of literature, films or any such socio-cultural text. So, given this sort of an approach towards narratives, this sort of a dialectical critical approach towards narratives, Jameson also argues that there is a cultural logic inherent as part of every kind of capitalism which had been part of all kinds of societies. In that sense, there exists a cultural or literary equivalent of all kinds of capitalisms. In that sense, he talks about how realism operates during the age of market capitalism, and modernism is a dominant during imperialism, and how postmodernism thus becomes logically the part of multinational capitalism. So, all of these forms of literary and cultural expressions such as realism, modernism and postmodernism, Jameson argues they are all merely cultural expressions of a deeper socio-economic form of capitalism. In that sense, every literary or cultural age or every literary or artistic expression is the equivalent of different kinds of capitalism, and also derives from a certain logic that each of these different kinds of capitalisms entail. Jameson's particular work, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, is based on two major assumptions. One, popular and mass culture could be a means of evaluating and assimilating political conditions. Two, postmodernity is a consequence of late capitalism, because late capitalism, by late capitalism, he also means the age of diffused production, of multinational capital, of speculative finance and electronic linkages. So, taking off from the ideas of narrative from the Marxist perspective, and also about the various kinds of critiques against capitalism, it becomes only logical that postmodernism is at loggerheads with the Marxist political, social and cultural ideas. So, what does postmodernism do in this sense? To quote Jameson, this whole global yet American postmodern culture is the internal and superstructural expression of a whole new wave of American military and economic domination throughout the world. Here, domination is a key term over here. Though postmodernism rejects all kinds of domination and moves rhizomatically against any kind of hierarchical as well as structural approaches, one of the key critiques that Jameson posits against postmodernism is that it also has a propensity towards various forms of domination. And this could be seen very evidently in connection with the capitalist tendencies which are demonstrated, which are illustrated in different kinds of postmodernisms. And having said that, he draws their attention to the consequences of mass culture. When we talk about capitalism and when we talk about postmodernism, it's important to be aware of the consequences of mass culture. And Jameson draws our attention precisely to that. Some of the things that Jameson finds problematic with the mass culture is that it assimilates even the radical into commonplace. So, with this absence of hierarchy, with this absolute breakdown of distinctions between high art and mass culture, there is no place for the radical, because the radical can no longer be separate, no longer be distinguished from the commonplace. So, even those things which were once considered radical or revolutionary, they have lost their significance, their political and also their cultural significance as something radical. Secondly, as we have already noted, postmodernism and by extension the mass culture, it converts all art forms into commodities. And art in that sense becomes reduced to a consumer product with little intrinsic value as art. Art is no longer art, and we've also seen how Baudrillard talks about the various kinds of imitations, the different kinds of productions of hyper-reality, and how we have access not to the original but only to copies and copies of copies. And here Jameson particularly draws our attention to this idea of depthlessness, because the mass culture imposed by postmodernism, it implies a culture of surface appearance with no depth value. And to illustrate this point, he also brings in a discussion of Vincent van Gogh and Andy Warhol, and he draws their attention to two paintings, one a 19th century work, A Pair of Shoes by Vincent van Gogh, and the 20th century work by Andy Warhol, a digital painting titled Diamond Dust Shoes. And here we also find in terms of the artistic periods that they occupy, one is part of high modernism and Warhol's work is part of postmodernism. They are both thematically related, as we can see. It's about shoes. But there is much more to this than meets the eye, and Jameson uses this distinction, the distinction between Van Gogh's painting and the digital art by Warhol, to talk about the ways in which high modernist art and postmodernist art differs in certain critical rendering, how it is impossible to look for any kind of depth, any kind of meaning in the postmodern art, and in this meaninglessness he finds a certain futility as well. Though postmodernism is inherently also about moving away from these kinds of distinctions, Jameson is also making us very succinctly aware to the impossibility of any kind of a political critique or any kind of a cultural critique in the wake of postmodernism. With the first painting, Van Gogh's A Pair of Shoes, it's actually drawing our attention to something beyond the actual shoes, and Jameson also uses Heidegger's interpretation of A Pair of Shoes by Vincent van Gogh and talks about how this is a reconstruction of a whole peasant life itself. But on the other hand, there is an impossibility to engage with Warhol's painting in the first place. It's about the depthlessness of cultural products. But what bothers Jameson and many other Marxist critics is that in a painting such as Warhol's, and in such a digital painting which is only an imitation, there is nothing in it to allow us to take a hermeneutic step. It's also because there is nothing behind the actual image that one can look for. This sits very well with a number of postmodern theories that we have discussed, a number of postmodern concepts that we have been talking about. But it's also important to take a look at the ways in which Jameson finds it impossible to engage with Andy Warhol's postmodern painting vis-a-vis the modernist painting by Vincent van Gogh. In order to give you a sense of the original work by Jameson, I also read certain excerpts from his work, Postmodernism or the Cultural Logic of Late Capitalism, and this is from the first two sections, where we also see Jameson using his prowess as a cultural critique, as a literary critique, and how he draws our attention to the different modes of criticism which a modernist painting and a postmodernism painting invites us to. I read from Jameson's work. We will begin with one of the canonical works of high modernism in visual art. Van Gogh's well-known painting of the peasant shows an example which you can imagine has not been innocently or randomly chosen. I want to propose two ways of reading this painting, both of which in some fashion reconstruct the reception of the work in a two-stage or double-level process. I first want to suggest that if this copiously reproduced image is not to sink to the level of sheer decoration, it requires us to reconstruct some initial situation out of which the finished work emerges. Unless that situation, which has vanished into the past, is somehow mentally restored, the painting will remain an inert object, a reified end product, impossible to grasp as a symbolic act in his own right, as a praxis and as production. These are terms very important for Marxist criticism. This last term suggests that one way of reconstructing the initial situation to which the worker's somehow response is by stressing the raw materials, the initial content which it confronts and reworks, transforms and appropriates. In Van Gogh, that content, those initial raw materials are, I will suggest, to be grasped simply as a whole object world of agricultural misery, of stark rural poverty, and the whole rudimentary human world of back-breaking peasant toil, a world reduced to its more brutal, menaced, primitive and marginalized state. So this sort of reading, Jameson goes on to say, is impossible to undertake with Andy Warhol. Now we need to look at some shoes of a different kind, and it is pleasant to be able to draw for such an image on the recent work of the central figure in contemporary visual art. Andy Warhol's diamond dust shoes evidently no longer speaks to us with any of the immediacy of Van Gogh's footgear. Indeed, I am tempted to say that it does not really speak to us at all. Nothing in this painting organizes even a minimal place for the viewer who confronts it at the turning of a museum corridor or gallery with all the contingency of some inexplicable natural object, or the level of the content. We have to do with what are now far more clearly fetishes in both the Freudian and the Marxian senses. Moving on, he argues that, therefore, in Warhol, no way to complete the hermeneutic gesture and restore to these oddments that whole larger lived context of the dance hall or the ball, the world of jet set fashion or glamour magazines. Yet this is even more paradoxical in the light of biographical information. Warhol began his artistic career as a commercial illustrator for shoe fashions and a designer of display windows in which various pumps and slippers figured prominently. Indeed, one is tempted to raise here, far too prematurely, one of the central issues about postmodernism itself and its possible political dimensions. Andy Warhol's work, in fact, turns centrally around commodification, and the great billboard images of Coca-Cola bottle or Campbell's soup can, which explicitly foreground the commodity fetishism of a transition to a late capital, ought to be powerful and critical political statements. If they are not that, then one would surely want to know why, and one would want to begin to wonder a little more seriously about the possibilities of political or critical art in the postmodern period of late capital. I use this rather lengthy piece from Jameson to put forward this argument, which he clearly articulates about the possibility of political or critical art in the postmodern period of late capital. Moving on from this rather self-explanatory passage, we also look at how Jameson argues that postmodernism promotes and postmodernism rather fetishizes a culture of pastiche. Pastiche means imitation or a parody, and it's also it could also be referred to as the repetition of former modernist styles without anything unique for itself anything original to claim for itself. It's in that sense repetition without any kind of uniqueness, any kind of originality. It could also be termed as mimicry or a parody. In that sense, when he talks about pastiche, which could also be identified in Warhol's paintings as Jameson does, it's also about the rejection of older styles, and this rejection, the mere rejection, becomes a style in itself. One doesn't have to try too hard to be original, to be creative. The rejection of an older modernist style becomes postmodernist by itself. So in that sense, Jameson was also a bit critical and very, very dismissive about the kind of art which is dominant in the postmodern period. And thereby we also note that there are no original artists or objects, and these are certain things which we have surveyed a little earlier in the course as well, about the lack of originality, about the absence of any idea of the original or the copy. And we only have imitations and pastiches instead. We only have copies and copies of copies, and there are no originals to compare with. Maybe one of the other recent examples that we can use to talk about pastiche would be the remix phenomenon in the contemporary, where it becomes impossible to locate the original in certain cases, and the remix or the copy becomes the original version just by virtue of being an imitation. And these are some of the major examples of pastiche or parody. There's this painting, Mona Lisa by Leonardo da Vinci, as we all know. It's a 16th century, early 16th century work. There's also a parody by pastiche by Marcel Duchamp. It's this kind of imitation, it is this a kind of a parody that the Marxist critics are extremely critical of. They do not find anything original, anything inherently creative in these kind of works, but they only see this as a degradation of art and also a removal of art from any political or historical context. There's also another pastiche of Salvador Dali's painting. And here we also find a kind of a mimicry at work over here, a kind of parody at work over here, and it becomes impossible to even figure out what the parody stands for, unlike the original modernist painting, which talks about the modernist crisis and the passage of time. And it also operates at different levels. There is this famous photograph of the Beatles, which has been parodied in the form of a pastiche in this postmodern version over here. So to sum up, I draw your attention to three features of postmodernism that Jameson says he's extremely uncomfortable with. He also seeks to criticize postmodernism on the basis of three major features that he highlights in the first two sections of his work. First of all, there's an emergence of a new kind of depthlessness, and this is not something positive that he argues. And secondly, there's a role of photography and the photographic negative, which he argues has come to replace art in particular ways, and it also takes away the possibility of any kind of uniqueness or creativity within the artist. And thirdly, he's more concerned about the waning of effect in postmodern culture. Jameson talks extensively about these three features and how they also characterize the end of certain kinds of dilemmas which were part and parcel of the modernist crisis. And the end of this dilemma and the embracement of a new kind of fragmentation is not something the Marxists are very comfortable with. And in the next session, we shall continue to look at some of the concerns raised from the Marxist point of view as charges as criticisms leveled against postmodernism. It's also important to understand this perspective. It's also important to engage with Jameson as well as Terry Eagleton at length, because it also gives us a different vantage point from which we can engage with postmodernism. And postmodernism, in that sense, it's not about a single point of view. It's not about accepting a unified or a totalizing view of things. And so we also encourage these diverse aspects which engage with postmodernism in order to be able to understand postmodernism at work in different literary and cultural contexts. So with that, we come to the end of today's lecture. Thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.